Peter began his investment career as a financial consultant with Shermson Lehman. Those of you who were here last year heard Peter make some predictions. Some of those predictions have come true. Now let's hear Peter Schiff.
You will get me a glass of water.
State that I'm on the same side of the political spectrum as Barry. I mean, I believe in pretty much all the same things: a limited government, freedom, capitalism, sound money, the rule of law, private property, all the concepts believed by the founding fathers when they first created this republic. Unfortunately, few, if any, of those principles are applicable to the modern American economy. Now, I'm going to talk mainly today about the real estate market and the mortgage market, because I know that's the most relevant to the people in the room. But let me first talk a little bit about broader economic picture and where we are as a nation. You know, sure, when we were first formed as a republic a couple hundred years ago, the reason that we prospered and the reason we became the world's wealthiest creditor nation, I mean this back in 1980 anyway, was because we had a comparative advantage in economic freedom. Taxes were much lower, the government was far less intrusive here in America than were the kings and the despots all over Europe. So the American colonies and our new country prospered. And we certainly borrowed a lot of money from the Europeans in the 19th century. But what we did with that money, we invested that money in factories, in infrastructure. We made capital investments. And by taking that money and building factories, we became the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of high-quality, low-cost consumer goods. Even though we eventually paid the highest wages in the world, American products were still the cheapest in price and the highest in quality. And because we made productive use of the money that we borrowed from the Europeans, we were able to repay the debt. You see, when you borrow money and build a factory, the factory produces consumer goods. The consumer goods are sold. We sold those consumer goods, automobiles, sewing machines, dishwashers. We sold all these goods to the Europeans, and we paid off our debts. And we went from a debtor nation to a creditor nation. And by 1980, we were not only the world's greatest creditor nation, but we had more foreign assets that were owned by Americans than all the other creditor nations in the world combined. We're the world's biggest lender around the world. We lent money, you know, Americans were wealthy lenders. We had a high savings rate. All that is different in modern America. Today, the United States is not the world's largest creditor nation. We're not even a creditor nation. We're the world's largest debtor nation. In fact, we owe more than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. We no longer flood the world with high-quality, low-cost manufactured goods. We flood the world with our paper currency, our IOUs, because we no longer possess the industrial might or the capability of producing those goods ourselves. Instead of being the world's biggest lender, we are the world's biggest borrowers. The United States routinely borrows from the poorest countries in the world. Now, according to modern economic thinking, right, this new state of affairs is somehow sustainable and a viable economic symbiotic relationship between America and the rest of the world. The relationship is America consumes and everybody else produces. America borrows and everybody else saves. And, you know, on the surface, potentially that argument can make sense, right? Without American consumption, what would all these Chinese do for jobs? Well, as was pointed out by Barry, it's not about jobs, right? It's about consumption. It's about standards of living. You don't want jobs just so you can work. You want jobs so that you can consume, that you can have a higher standard of living. The fact that Chinese get jobs in exchange for the products they give us doesn't do any good for the Chinese. The Chinese are perfectly capable of consuming their output themselves. They don't need their government to artificially suppress the exchange rate of the yuan so they can artificially elevate the value of the dollar so that Americans get to consume all the goods that the Chinese could have consumed had it not been for that monetary policy. But this current dynamic, where we don't save and we don't produce, is not viable. It's no more viable than the economic models that existed in the 1990s with respect to internet stocks or technology companies, where Wall Street had people believe that stock prices could rise regardless of the fact that the companies had no earnings, paid no dividends, without any regard to any fundamental measure of valuation. We were told that it was a new era, and we saw what happened there. And the same Wall Street economists that told us the internet era was a new era are now telling us that this current era of American consumption and global production is viable, and it's not. And I'll give you a quick little analogy and then move on to another subject. I mentioned this on my website, and I've used it at various speaking engagements. But to describe this dynamic, assume that a group of castaways are stranded on an island. Let's say 5 of them are Asian, and 1 of them is an American. And when they're stranded on this island, they have to divvy up the workload. So one of the Asians is given the job of hunting and looking for meat. Another one is going to be fishing, trying to catch fish. Another one is in charge of scourging the island for vegetation. Still another one gets the job of looking for wood to build a fire and cook the meal. And then it comes down to the American. They say, well, you know, what job are we going to assign the American? Well, the American gets assigned the job of eating. And so at the end of the day, all these Asians gather around this big table after a hard day of foraging and hunting and fishing, and they prepare to feed this American, who did nothing all day but sun himself on the beach. He had a service economy. In any event, a modern economist who is looking at this little island's economy would say, oh, the American is the key to the whole thing. Without that American and his ravenous appetite, these poor Asians would have nothing to do all day. They'd all be unemployed. Well, the reality is, the Asians are perfectly capable of consuming the food themselves. Now, perhaps if they didn't have to spend all day long feeding this fat American, they wouldn't have to work as hard. Maybe they could pursue other interests that they had. The best thing that they can do to improve their own standards of living would be to kick that American off the island. Of course, when that happens, the American's in trouble, because now he doesn't have 5 Asians doing all of his work. You know, it almost reminds me a lot of that book, Tom Sawyer, you know, where Tom is able to convince all of his friends to whitewash his fence for him, and to not only do that, but to pay him for the privilege. Because Tom Sawyer got his friends so convinced that there was so much joy in this toil that it was worth paying him. And so he got the world to do his chores. And little did you know, Samuel Clemens realize that that little passage in that book would one day form the basis of the global economy, where America convinced 1 billion Chinese to paint our fence and to pay us for the privilege. That's going to end. In fact, the Chinese have been talking this week about diversifying, you know, out of their $1 trillion in reserves. Of course, they can't diversify out of them. They're kind of stuck with them. But the minute they stop buying dollars, it's over. But let me just go back a little bit to where we are right now and how we got here most recently. Back in the 1990s, we had a bubble in the stock market. The bubble, like most bubbles, was created by Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve, and monetary policy that was too loose and too inflationary, even in the 1990s. The inflation that was created manifests itself in rising asset prices. And during that time period, there are a lot of malinvestments, as Mises calls them, made. A lot of that easy money funded a lot of cockamamie investments in telecommunications and internet companies that never should have seen the light of day. Ultimately, Greenspan started to raise interest rates and take away that monetary stimuli that he had supplied during the 90s. And eventually,